Hello everyone and welcome to Data Matters with me, Vicky Gilwar, and my partner, Steve Wright.
Hello.
Today we're really fortunate to be joined by Beverley Flynn. Hi Beverley.
Hi Vicky.
Beverley is a partner at Stevens & Bolton, and we also have Jonathan Wood with us. Hi Jonathan.
Hello, welcome everyone.
Jonathan is CEO at C2 Cyber. So today, within our GDPR maturity series, we are looking at the topic of data processors and third parties. In my experience, this has often been an area that causes a lot of confusion, particularly around who is the controller, who is the processor? Is it them? Is it us? Is it both? In addition, third parties often appear to get a bad press when it comes to incidents and get the blame when things go wrong. But is it really their fault? We've got quite a few questions to get through this week, and I think it's going to be a really rich discussion. So let's get going, and I'm going to start with Beverley. So as a starting point, can you break down for us what data processors and third parties mean in legal terms, please?
Yes, of course, Vicky. Well, I'm assuming we've got a pretty sophisticated audience here, but for those who aren't aware, they're all defined in Article 4 of the GDPR, and we have 4 or 5 definitions in there, including controller, joint controller, processor, and third party. And a processor is somebody who or something that processes on behalf of the controller. So it's literally an outsourced function or a provider to the controller.
Excellent, thanks Beverley, really clear. And I'm just going to go over to you now, Jonathan. Can you tell us what some of the problems are that are associated with third parties from a cybersecurity perspective, please?
Certainly, thanks Vicky. So essentially the big problem is the unknown. So we now have a legal obligation in the UK DPA 2018 GDPR based, and so you're handing this data over, or you're exchanging data or allowing access to your information and your client's information with a third party. And that third party may have a different maturity and security posture to yours, and therefore you run the risk of them or their fourth parties. Financial services now focusing on fourth parties, where they've got a big systems integrator in, but they don't know who that systems integrator is passing their data on to. So the whole chain of third, fourths and fifths is becoming ever more important. For today, I'll just say third party, because as in the name, but if we can assume that fourths and fifths are also becoming increasingly worrisome to people that are particularly regulated industries, you just don't know what they're doing with your data and whether they've secured it.
Excellent, thanks Jonathan. Yeah, I think it's good to understand that, you know, as you say, it's not just about one, it's about a series of external organisations. And Steve, you know, can you talk to us about how these third parties are typically exploited?
Yeah, I think to Jonathan's point, what we find quite often is a variant in the level of sophistication or technical organisational controls that the third party has implemented. And you know, bad people, bad actors as they're known, they are actually looking for those exploits. So what we find, and if you look at a lot of the incidents and the enforcement cases that have come on the back of those, you can find there's normally a third party at play here, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the organisations won't go for the big banks or financial organisations. They go for the weak spot, right? And the weak spot is often the third party. And second of all, the level of technical expertise in a small organisation, especially if it's a specialist outsourcer, say for HR processes or something like that, payroll or something like that, depending on what it is, they won't necessarily have the level of dedicated sophistication, technology or expertise on hand to help them thwart what are very complicated and very successful attacks being led by criminal gangs, criminal organised, even rogue states. So we do find that it's not necessarily the big, large organisations, but it's the vulnerable, smaller third parties that actually have been granted access under the contract to provide the service, and it's those that are being targeted, and that's why it's a big concern for us.
Thanks, Steve. Again, really clear. And in terms of those vulnerabilities, Beverley, what about from a legal risk perspective? How has that changed since the introduction of the GDPR?
Oh, I would say it's changed enormously. I'd actually go back to the 1984 Act when processors were called computer bureaus, so showing my age slightly, but under the 84 Act and under the 1998, there wasn't really much responsibility placed on processors. I think it's fair to say that really it was the contractual provisions between the controller and the processor. But now under the GDPR, processors are also responsible and they have liabilities. On top of that, they can face compensation claims, and the contract between the controller and the processor under Article 28 is also not only just principle based, but actually quite specific. So their liability in contract as well is much greater, I would say.
Thanks, Beverley. Yeah, so we have the legal risk there, and the risk of lack of controls and vulnerabilities. Jonathan, can you tell us, in your experience, some of the challenges from a security perspective that you've witnessed in the supply chain?
So specifically after DPA 2018 came in here in the UK, one of the principal challenges was who owns the risk inside the organisation that you are trying to help. So in our client base, one of the things that they struggle with their third parties is they'll go to the third party, or we will go to the third party on their behalf in a service environment and say, so who owns that risk? And it might be the chief legal counsel who has read GDPR on the train and knows it exists, but they haven't actually implemented it. IT thinks the legal guy owns it, and the legal guy thinks that ops owns it. And you go round the tree in this company, the sales manager can't sell anything to our client because they can't sign a GDPR addendum or something that's compliant. So the biggest challenge is that nobody owns the risk. And therefore, if nobody owns the risk, there's no budget to address some of the shortfalls and the things where mitigation attracts a cost. So the other challenge is, how do you get the board on board, so to speak, in funding mitigation activities, and then you'll start to get some traction. The other challenges are things like, if you've been shoveling data into this third party for the last 2-3 years, or in some cases we found a 50-year-old contract that wasn't written down in a large retailer, how does that information get destroyed? Does it get destroyed? There's nothing that says that it's ever been got rid of, so they know more about your customers than you do. And they've got piles of data that they never got rid of. They may have a legitimate interest, but they've not got rid of it. And so there are lots of areas that prove challenging, unless everyone understands what they're trying to do.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we've talked a lot about vulnerabilities and legal risk, but what about enforcement? Steve, can you provide some examples of some enforcement cases by regulators in this area?
I mean, certainly, Vic. We've all got the big cases that come straight to mind, like the Marriott security breach and the British Airways security breach. But what I'm seeing is I use the enforcement tracker database, which is provided by CMS law firm, which is actually a really good tool to be using for any DPO. And what worries me is the all of these data protection authorities around Europe, and the ICO is no different, will often be called in on the back of some sort of incident, some sort of data leak, some sort of data breach. And you then get to read and understand more about what, the fines are actually relatively small, but they're frequent. And, there are a number this month alone, and this usually comes under Article 32, which is the Technical Security Organisational controls or measures that should be in place, which are found time and time again by these data protection authorities lacking. And it goes back to our earlier point. I think the issue, though, is more about the if you look at the cases, the complexity of some of those. Like, you had the Romanian data protection authority, taking enforcing an action against an organisation because they were sharing customer data via WhatsApp, and there was, there's more and more of Article 32 in particular being used for a broader, if you like, definition of what can be fined under the current regime, and the reason that's important is because what we're seeing, in my opinion, is the data protection authorities really starting to understand their space a lot more, and so that the type of investigation that an enforcement action comes, and the next day the regulator could be on your doorstep, either forcing you to cease, to commence working on that particular data set, but the speed of which they can come in and then seize equipment, and it could have catastrophic effect to your business and to your operation. But the level of sophistication is growing in terms of what, the nuances of what they're saying, and that to me, that's an encouraging sign, because the whole industry is still relatively nascent. But what we're seeing is more and more of these enforcement cases, as you read into the details of each case, proving that the regulators, the ICO, and around Europe and beyond, actually, are really gaining a very good appreciation of these exploits and how they're being used against these organisations. So it's an interesting space, but it's growing, and the level of sophistication and understanding from the DPAs is starting to catch up.
Thanks, Steve. So before we look a little bit at the risk mitigation, did you have anything to add, Beverley, around specific case law in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting at the moment is that on one of those cases, the regulator, when they looked into it, it was the Marriott one, they actually found that on the acquisition of the business, that they hadn't actually undertaken enough due diligence at that stage, and hadn't appreciated that when they actually acquired the business, that there was a back door open. And so effectively, to me, that's even going beyond what one might have expected from a regulator, and actually doing your DD at the time, as well as ongoing remediation. I think that for me was the biggest, not surprise, but takeaway.
And Beverley, again, how are data processing agreements and standard contractual clauses making a difference to an individual's privacy in the EU, do you think?
I think for individuals, the situation's slightly different. It's definitely helping them. One, because we're behind the scenes when we're all negotiating them, everybody's actually taking an interest. And it's surprising now when you negotiate them that you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of, is it personal data, before you even actually get into the DPA itself. And then when you're in the DPA, it's, are we controller, are we joint controller, are we processor? So I see that as helping the individual, because actually the underlying industry now is taking an interest, even, from procurement through to DPO, through to IT, wherever you are in the chain. For individuals themselves, however, the right to bring compensation claims obviously is an advantage. And under the standard contractual clauses, there are actually third-party rights which enable, believe it or not, for individuals to potentially make use of the standard clauses themselves. And again, under the DPAs, if third-party rights aren't extracted and they're drafted in a sloppy way, then individuals could make use of those as well in some circumstances. So I think on the whole, it is going to help individuals, but really it's helping individuals by the contractual mechanisms being more fine-tuned and actually parties taking an interest throughout the chain.
Great, thanks Beverley, I think that's really helpful. So Jonathan, is this then a good or a bad thing for the third party organisations?
So overall, this is a great thing, because particularly if you own the risk, if you're the DPO or the CISO, this starts to gather some awareness in the board and the people that make the decisions around how to resource you attending to this risk and improving the posture of the organisation. And by which I mean, we've seen boards that have gone from, how do you spell GDPR, to let's have a tabletop exercise because we don't want to be like that other company I saw in the paper on the train. And that's happening more and more. And in the language at the board level, they want to know if they drop a breach on the table that the process has been practiced inside their IT organisation. And right down at the smaller level, so we're a small company, you guys are a small company, we're very aware at the scale that we are and the industry we're in. If you're making a particular bit of kit that supplies your client and you're the third party, are you focused on data so much or supplying the physical thing? They then have to remember, and they're invited to, that the employees' data is just as important. So this is not so much about individuals outside your organisation, it applies just as much to the ones inside. So HR start to get involved in the tabletop exercise around payroll and charitable donations, and where is that information going? Why are you emailing the payroll and charity data to the processor? Why is it not secure? You shouldn't be doing that. And all those questions get asked, because you get the creative thing flowing in the tabletop exercise. So I think there are lots of things that don't cost huge amounts of money that come out of this. It's more about awareness and then generating an SLA. So out the back of the awareness is, right, we need to be good at this. And our suppliers as well, we need a service level agreement that says they'll destroy the data at this point in time if it's not been used. And we'll tell them within 12 hours that we've had a breach, because actually the client who gave us the data, the controller, has only got 72 hours to report it. And so all of that awareness causes the third party to raise its game. And it's not just about spending money, it's about doing it better.
Thanks, Jonathan. So just building on that then, and you clearly talked about awareness as being key to this. Why do you think it is so hard for some organisations to operationalise this, though?
So from an operational perspective, a lot of this is new. So even if one is an IT director or styled as a CISO but was an IT director before and is learning how to do the security bit, we try to practice international standards because we support enterprises mostly, and the international standards are more recognisable when an organisation is based in lots of different continents. So if you choose ISO 27001 as the standard for information security, you've got the domains in there which track along quite nicely against your privacy domains that you've been covering in Data Matters. And so there's usually a technical control set that applies to the domain that you've been describing in your webinars. So whether it's identity management, do you know who they are, and access management, should they be able to get in, or physical security, the CCTV that everyone in the UK knows and loves, because I think we've got more CCTV cameras per capita than anywhere else in the world. But where does that data go? And so I think they find it difficult to get the bits of the business that are not information security related to understand their operational processes need to change to make them safer. And that's again, I don't mean to plug training and awareness too much because that's your shop, but that is a training and awareness piece inside bigger organizations. And so we've been doing some of that for vendor risk management specifically to teach business owners and business unit owners around the world for our clients that they need to focus on information security. So an organization that's buying a new bit of kit or a product in a nation a long way away from where the headquarters is still needs to consider, do I need that data about our clients, and do I need their inside leg measurement? If they're in a fashion brand, they may need it, but should they keep it for 6 months? Probably not. maybe they should get rid of it after they've made the garment. And so there's lots of nuances where it's detail, but it's difficult to operationalize that when not everyone's an information security professional. So how do you drag them along with you to being safer? It is difficult. There is no easy answer.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I just wanted to bring accountability into the piece here, because it just feels like we need to talk about it as part of this. So I'm going to ask something of you, Steve. Do you think that there is a need for some of the larger organisations that are employing third parties to just consider whether or not, or do a bit more to consider whether or not they're fulfilling these contractual obligations that they're expecting them to abide by? Just going back to the awareness point, should there be some onus or responsibility on those organisations to make sure that there is that awareness and training that Jonathan has just talked about in place?
That's a good question, Vicky. Thank you. I think the accountability principle and is a great point to bring up here, because for me, the clients that we support, what I see time and time again is a lack of that accountability and ownership, not just on the data sets, but actually on the contracts. And this is a big problem, because the current, in fact, I'm just reviewing with our privacy lawyer, Esgy, the contractual clauses for an organisation that it turns out we never did any due diligence for several years ago when they first came on. And, you know, they're now looking to migrate the software development over into Spain from here in London for a variety of reasons, including Brexit. And so we've now got to consider that for this client. You know, what are the ramifications of that? How do we make sure, you know, that they're protected? But the other thing that is really apparent is the fact that they just relied on, best endeavours, if you like. And I do empathise, because this is expensive, time-consuming business to go and validate everybody, to do due diligence on every third party that you're going to engage with. Takes a lot of time and effort. And what I've certainly seen in organisations that I've worked for as a DPO is you have this initial procurement process that's heavily engaged. You know, they want to know everything about the organisation. They satisfy themselves, and then that's it. It moves out. You know, and then it gets lost into this sort of in between the procurement contract managers or contract management systems, etc. And no one really owns it, and therefore that accountability, as soon as that contract's gone live, starts to diminish. And I think that's where we're possibly having problems here, because if it was a contract that I was responsible for, I'd want to make sure that they're up to date, as Jonathan said, with the latest standards, that they're adopting these things, and we're regularly testing, penetration testing some of the communication channels that we may use. And you know, so I think you're right to bring in the word accountability. And so for me, I think it's not just the one problem of bringing them on board straight away. It's then who manages it through the life cycle of that contract is where we're seeing a lot of these weaknesses.
Thanks, Steve. And Beverley, do you have any thoughts on the same topic from a legal perspective? Do you think those companies should have some kind of obligation to follow it through, as Steve said?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just to Steve's point, one of the most interesting things for me to see as we go on through the cycle of GDPR is the number of DPAs I've negotiated where we've fought over the audit rights. Who's actually exercised an audit right? It would be lovely to know, and to do a kind of, backwards and forwards looking exercise to see how many people have actually bothered to exercise those audit rights. That would be really telling, I think, and I think that's something that the future will hold for us.
Thanks, Beverley, and to Steve there. I think that was really well answered. So I think what we might do before we round out, if it's okay with you guys, with what good looks like, is just run through a couple of questions, because we have got quite a few come in today. So I'm just going to start with a question that says, we just said third party. This term is used a lot in the everyday world of privacy and data protection. Can you unpick when and where that term is appropriate in a GDPR context or e-privacy? When I read the GDPR, I'm left with a strong view that we should not be using the term third party unless it's in a very narrow and specific usage implied by the law. Am I being too pedantic? I think that's a good question. Can I ask Beverley to look at answering that as a starting point?
Thank you for that, Vicky, and thank you for that question. Are you being too pedantic? I'm going to be a typical lawyer and actually keep on the grey side of that question. Third party is actually defined in the GDPR. A lot of people don't even appreciate that, and I have got my very dog-eared copy here, and it does say any natural person, etc., other than the data subject, the controller, or the processor, who, under the direct authority of the controller processor, are authorised to process the data. And it's a very difficult definition. We all, to be fair, we all struggle with it. We wonder why it's in there, what's it to be used for? Does it mean a parallel processor? I've seen some commentary that says it's actually a gateway provider. We've thought, does it mean sub-processor? So you're not being pedantic, and it is a good question, and one that we can't always necessarily have the right answer to. But certainly processor and sub-processor are well known, I think, for everyone at the moment.
Perfect, thanks Beverley. Another question, given that the ICO has largely been unable to enforce action upon the likes of BAA and Marriott, how can we maintain the level of awareness and board level buy-in when CEOs don't see the risk from a financial penalty basis? Do you want to take that one, Jonathan, as a starting point?
Yeah, I can start. So there is the financial side, and I think back in 2015, 2016, everyone was talking about it'll be 4% of your global turnover, and everyone hurriedly worked that out on the back of an envelope, and that hasn't in most cases come to pass, although some of those fines are significant enough for the organisations concerned. This is not just financial though. So if I pointed a couple like the Carphone warehouse last year, that might not have a very, very serious financial implication for Carphone warehouse and its owners. But does it pass the red face test when the information lost is quite important to the customers of that organisation? I don't think so. And so will they reputationally, where would you choose to shop as a consumer after that event? So they might not just get a whacking great fine, HMRC, 30 days to pay, but they may see a hit in their sales figures. They might see a hit in their margin figures. It would have been an awful lot cheaper to run down the secure by design front and maybe operate the development of their stuff in a different way.
The question was a good one. This is not just monetary penalties here. This is about trust, and you know, we as consumers are now much more empowered on the back of GDPR. We have far more rights, and we can you know, enact those rights, and I think that's a really important thing, first of all, to say that, you know, any business that is just purely looking at this from a perspective of trying to avoid the actual fine is slightly missing the point, because yes, that will drive the mentality, but and certainly, you know, I used to work for the CFO of John Lewis, and that was front and foremost on his mind. But actually, what we were really interested in was what our consumers, what our customers felt and thought about us. And as a brand, John Lewis, as an example, had spent a long time and a lot of blood, sweat and tears over 150 years building the integrity of that brand. And so, certainly back then, and I'm sure is now, it was very important that the fines were almost secondary. It was, as Jonathan said, it was much more about, just making sure that we stayed on the right side of our customers, that we didn't have that red face moment.
Yeah, well said.
Thanks, Steve. We've got quite a few more questions, so I'm just going to try and see if we can get through these before we come back to looking at what good looks like. There's a couple around audit rights. How do you do this in a cost-efficient manner? Any kind of questionnaire available as a starting point? Beverley, I think.
Beverley first. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I would say what I would say is that when I'm negotiating, sometimes what the processors will provide are copies of their latest audit, or they will actually prepare for you customer facing or controller facing audits, and they'll bring in third parties to do that. So it's always worthwhile asking for a copy of that, or contractually obliging them to do that and provide you with it, on an annual basis or however frequently you want. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Jonathan, you had something to add, I think.
So part of the audit process, how are they actually safeguarding that data? And we see this a lot in managed services for vendor risk management. And so one can drown in data. You build your own team to manage what we're talking about today, third-party risk, and you have to train them up. 6 months to get them ready, perhaps. They're not experts if you've done this internally. They've got all this data. They've demanded SARBOX reports, SOC reports, 1s and 2s. Everything is pouring into this team who have absolutely no idea what's in these reports, and they open them. And that's when they open them. We actually had an incident once where we opened something that was called the ISO 27001 compliance certificate, and it was a picture of a red setter. And what they never expected us to do was open the PDF. It was going to get filed, and that's because the organisation and the team were not experts in vendor risk management. So you're drowning in this data and you filed it. So you can turn around to the ICO and say, yes, we asked that organisation as a third party for their ISO 27K certificate, SOC 1, SOC 2. And we filed them and we got them in this file. But actually, if they don't pass muster, we wouldn't know anyway. And that's the challenge. So do you build that capability internally? And if it's not your core role, if you're actually making a commodity, then that's not your core business. Outsource it, get rid of it. Use a third party, another third party to assure your supply chain for you. And then they do know what they're doing.
Thanks, Jonathan. Unfortunately, we've only got time for one last question. So I'm just going to go to the last question, and then we'll look to try and answer the others offline if possible. I think this is quite a good one because we haven't talked about it. Public sector, where although we don't have a client base as such and so can't lose customers, we're still open to public scrutiny.
Can I start with that one?
Of course.
Absolutely right. In terms of third parties specifically, there's a different relationship with the public sector whether you're going direct or through a G Cloud or similar activity with central government, CCS framework. But you do have employees who do have rights, whether they're in uniform or civil servants or similar. And so from employee perspectives, you've got the same challenges. If you're using a third-party HR processor for civil servants or military folk or similar, they have the same rights. So you need to assure your third parties so that data is safe. And there are lots of famous examples of vetting agencies and the rest losing data. That is now under DPA 2018. So that would be a good reason to go get budget and fix it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Any builds from Beverley on that one?
Well, I would say, interestingly enough, I love the FOIA. It's one of my favourite pieces of legislation. So I have empathy and sympathy with the individual who wrote that question. And yes, you can't lose the data. And no, you are subject to even further scrutiny. So I actually send you my sympathy rather than any helpful hints at this stage.
So I think we'll try and round off with thinking about some practical tips we can leave the audience with in terms of what good looks like. So Jonathan, did you want to start with that? And then Beverley pick up and Steve round off?
Sure. So just a quick one. There are lots of ways for you to assure your third parties. We've seen some great ones and we've seen some that needed some work. I would say that the first thing is, if you're being employed to run one of these, before you accept a job, make sure it comes with a budget or at least the ability to fight for one, because standing this up is not free. But if you are going to go down the route of assessing and assuring your third parties, the risk provision budget, which Steve and I have successfully used in some organisations before, is a good place to go shopping, because you can reduce the risk provision pot in a large enterprise and it pays for your vendor risk management 10 times over. So that is worth discussing with your CFO or financial controller. And find somebody that uses a lot of data to assure the things that your third parties are sending you, because sometimes it is nonsense and it's not backed up or it's in a different language. Use open sources, use data that's paid for but still open source, so OSINT that costs money, and check those things, because the only thing that you can't buy back is your reputation. So.
Excellent, thanks Jonathan, some great insights for the audience today. And from you, Beverley?
Well, mine's more about negotiating the contracts and doing the audits, but I would say, one, check it's personal data. You'd be amazed how many times it's not actually personal data that the third party's dealing with, so you don't need to worry. Two, decide whether they're a controller, a processor, or a joint controller, or a third party, because if they are just a processor, you're into Article 28, processing addendum. Three, when you're looking at your Article 28 processing addendum, don't lose sight, because everybody focuses on that one addendum, don't lose sight of the all general compliance with laws provision and what happens in the event of a conflict between the contract and the data protection addendum, and whether or not the limits on liability are going to apply, and scupper all that hard work. And then four, I would say just educate, train from all over the organisation. If you've got a procurement team that knows what they're doing, it will make your life much easier as the lawyer, and the DPOs much easier. That would be my main thrust, really.
Fantastic, thanks Beverley. And any thoughts from you, Steve, before we sign off?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the three things that I would like to emphasise, one is about this ownership and accountability, because identifying the owner and making sure that they stay the owner throughout the duration of the contract is really important. And just a little bit of a caveat with that, or a warning, be careful with the thresholds, because in a procurement cycle you might find that the thresholds doesn't invoke a data privacy impact assessment or any involvement of your privacy team, including your security team, if it's, say, under a £2,000 spend. And then, and sometimes software can fall under that, or certainly a single user license, but actually what's happening is they're capturing data. And I've seen that happen a lot, so just be careful of that one. But ownership, I mean, fantastic. Thanks, Beverley, because, we are privacy culture, and that's what we're all about. So training, communication, awareness was my second point. And then the third one, I think, is just about the point that Jonathan was making, really, about testing your what assurance are you going to provide? What mechanism are you going to use for that testing of those third parties? And what I would emphasize there, and being a DPO and a CISO in the past, it's really good to have independent validation of that, you know, so the testing of that, including things like penetration testing and depending on what the nature of it is really, really prudent to do, because ultimately at the end of the day with third parties, you are still going to be responsible. It's still you're going to be sweating and having uncomfortable conversations with your bosses as to why you didn't do enough on those third parties, which is why this is always a topical subject, third parties, and a difficult one. No, it's not easy, and it's just an ongoing, constant, if you like, thing that needs to be there and you need to be on top of.
Excellent, thank you, Steve. A really content-rich session today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. So it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Beverley.
Thank you, Vicky.
And goodbye from Jonathan.
Yep, farewell. Thanks for listening.
And finally, goodbye from Steve.
And I just want to promote next week's show. We have Gemma Haynes, who's coming in to talk to us all about cookies, privacy notices, disclaimers, etc., all around transparency, which is you know, something dear to my heart. So sorry, Vicky, I wasn't sure if you were going to mention it, but I just wanted to put a plug in for next Friday at 2 o'clock, all about transparency.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.